when I think that God his Son not sparing.
Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and I want to welcome you to our Journey of Faith in the Light of the Cross overview number 12. And I thank you so much for joining us. We look up here on our screen and we see the theme for this 12th overview. The exile editors in 580 BC in Babylon added to the words of Moses in 1180 BC at Sinai. For the same Yahweh inspired both to demand heroic observance of his covenant, which separated and uncovered Israel as Yahweh's pure and holy people. We go on to our next screen to understand this better. Studies show the editors were faithful to the Yahwist and Elohim writers' accounts of what Moses was inspired to teach at Sinai centuries before. Added on to Moses' words 600 years later in light of the Babylonian exile. Now, overview number 11, that's what OV means, overview number 11, the last one, focused on Yom Kippur in Leviticus 16 and the Leviticus 18 reading, which emphasized the word uncover. Do not uncover anyone. Note well, uncover in Greek is apocalypse. You've heard of the word apocalypse, the revelation. It also means to reveal, thus we have the book of Revelation ending the New Testament. Thus, do not uncover means do not reveal or expose an Israeli, because then Israel or Judah is shamed. Okay? We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. For Torah considers all nakedness shameful. Yet Moses covered the word calypso. Apo means uncover. Calypso is he covered his face after he spoke to Yahweh, for his face radiated power. Both the power of shame and God's presence caused mysterious, overwhelming feelings. Jesus was uncovered in shame on the cross. The disciples looked up and saw the radiance of God in Jesus' shame body as Moses at Sinai. God radiated through Jesus' shame to reveal he could and did love us and grace us even in our shame. Now, nobody could conceive of this. Human beings can't conceive of this, but God can do it. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. With God's grace, believers could feel God's radiant love in their most shameful moments, but only faith can feel the revelation of Jesus' Father redeeming human shame into love. But Torah teaches that shame prevents all humans from feeling at one with Yahweh, so we have to adjust ourselves when we go back to the Old Testament. Thus, when humans feel shame, they do not allow God or anyone else to be close or at one with them unless they have the faith. You could not love me if you knew my shame, what was inside me or inside my family. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Crucifixion made a leader so shamed and repulsive that his disciples could not recall his image without feeling disgust. And that's why the Romans did crucify Jesus or anyone. But believers reverence the shame of the cross. But to study Torah, all must put aside the love they feel in the shame of the cross and accept it. Shame isolated Israelis and Judeans from Yahweh. We got to put ourselves in that frame of mind. Ezekiel was a great influence on the priest who wrote this, and thus helps us better understand Leviticus. So we have to go back to Ezekiel now to understand Leviticus. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. But first we look at Torah book's journey up to Sinai and the Mosaic covenant. So we started these last couple of sections at Sinai with the revelation of the covenant to chapter 34. Then we continued through the end of Exodus to the laws of liturgy and conduct, and Exodus 25 to Leviticus, which we have been going through and we're going through in this overview. And then we will go on in our next overview to Numbers 10, which begins the journey back to the Promised Land. We go on to our next screen, and we continue with what we were reading about. Ezekiel spoke to Judah's shame. He pictured Israel, back at Sinai, as a baby girl aborted. That aborted originally meant to cut somebody away and just put them out to die, and left to die in the shame of slavery. 16:7, God said, "You grew to fullness, but you were naked. But I covered your shame with my cloak, and I made a covenant with you. I made you mine. I washed and anointed you. I clothed you with linen and girded you with fine linen underneath." This is very important. People were considered half naked unless they girded, that is belted, underclothing, which we get the word underwear. We go on to the next screen and we continue reading. The second exiles in 586 walked to Babylon in half-naked clothing, exposing them to easy sexual abuse, and they were abused, and they were humiliated. And when they came in, the first exiles felt the shame as deeply as the people who were abused. This left all exiles in deep, unforgettable shame. By analogy, Yahweh girded Israel's underlinen with belts or sashes, as all respectful women girded their underlinen. Only fully covered and girded underneath was a woman free from the shame of nakedness. Self-respecting Goyim, that's Gentiles, also thought this way. Thus, the word uncovered meant one lost self-respect. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Ezekiel 16:11. I also put fine jewelry on you. God is still talking to Israel. And a crown on your head, as word of your beauty spread. So Israel was doing great under the kingdoms in a time from Solomon down to the Babylonian exile. But full of yourself, you played the whore. You made phallic symbols out of my jewelry and covered them with my fine linen. And there's implications here. By analogy, Mother Israel uncovered herself and put her underlinen over phallic symbols, and it humiliated the whole country. Israel lost all self-respect, preferring fertility cult, sexual ecstasy, to Yahweh's life-giving sexual order as taught by Moses in the law. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Even worse, we continue with Ezekiel 16:21. You slaughtered daughters and sons in sacrifice. In your abominations, you did not recall when you were left out naked and bare when God rescued you. Ezekiel's priest disciples challenged the exiles to show that Judah's exiles had dignity and self-respect and could live honored and dignified ways of life, more modest and dignified even than the most dignified Gentiles. So we saw how Ezekiel led into it, but then the priests who were his disciples continued to challenge the people. Don't let this happen again. So Judeans covered their flesh to the extreme to avoid falling into pagan sexual ecstasy, and they continue to observe this in our own generation. We go on to the next screen and we continue reading. Whereas upper-class Babylonians did observe fertility cult sex, they would do it in tasteful, private nakedness. The Judeans mystified the Babylonians with their clothing, but they did win their trust, for it witnessed a more honorable morality. Now, lower-class people could revel in half-naked clothing sometimes because they couldn't afford any underclothing. To defy upper-class modesty, say, you make fun of us so we'll just celebrate it. But inside, poor people felt ashamed and knew they had lost self-respect. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. P demanded all Judaic exiles to act superior to upper-class Babylonians. They were not just equal, but their dignified clothing would help them live with superior honesty and dignity. Now we have another issue here. Why does Torah emphasize priests' clothing? 4 times, from Exodus to Leviticus, we just saw they come right after one another, they itemize the priest's dress. This was to give honor to Yahweh, but it also taught that as priestly people, all Judean men and women had to protect themselves from the shame of sexual abuse. We made it very difficult. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. On Yom Kippur, Leviticus 16:4, he, the high priest, shall put on the sacred linen tunic with linen breeches on his flesh, girded with a linen sash or belt. And after he has all that on, then put on the linen mitre, which the bishops use today. He must cover over any sense of nakedness in God's presence. Judean men mixed into the Babylonian world much more than women. So they needed to dress like priests, especially with breeches on their flesh, girded with a sash or a belt. It looked peculiar, but it did protect them. Now I emphasize the word peculiar because in Deuteronomy, God says to Israel, you must be willing to be peculiar. And they were, if they were true to God. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. The clothing also reminded Judeans, that is Yahweh's holy people, they had to look different. The word different means holy. Holy means different. As well as act different. You can't just look different, you got to act differently. Thus, Leviticus 18, the Yom Kippur reading, ends with P reminding the exiles in 580 of Moses' words to Israel 600 years before in 1180 at Sinai. They're still relevant. Leviticus 18:24. Do not defile yourselves as goyim, as the Gentiles do, who I will vomit out of the land that I will give you. So they're in the wilderness coming to the promised land, and he says, I'm going to vomit those people out and clear it for you. You must be free from the abominations they commit. Now this is important. Or the land will also vomit you out. The exiles in Babylon, they know what he said, because they were vomited out of Judah and they had to go to Babylon in exile. So these are very relevant words from Moses. We go on to the next screen and we continue reading. Ezekiel wrote that the exiles realized that they had defiled Judah with pagan abominations, and it was what had caused the land to vomit Judah out into Babylon twice. 597 and 586, the first exile and the second exile. Now, this is very important for us as Christians. 40 years after Jesus died in 70 AD, Judeans were vomited out of Judah by the Roman Empire. Some Judeans believed the crucifixion was the abomination that defiled Judah. But God redeemed Judah's exile, for it made the church realize it had a universal mission. So at first they rejected being pushed out of Judah, but when this came about, they said, God wants us out of Judah to spread the gospel all over the world. We go on to our next screen and we read our theme. The exile P editors in 580 BC enhanced the words of Moses in 1180 BC. For the same Yahweh inspired both to demand heroic observance of his covenant, which separated and uncovered Israel as Yahweh's pure and holy people. Thank you so much for joining us in this journey of faith in the light of the cross, overview number 12.
Then sings my soul.